The smoke-filled saloon in Copper Gulch held its breath as 7 men in crimson bandanas kicked through the swinging doors, their boots leaving muddy tracks on the freshly swept floor. They couldn't have known that the quiet barkeep polishing glasses with his weathered hands, a faded burn scar tracing his left forearm, was once known as Ghost Eye Mason, the deadliest bounty hunter west of the Mississippi, with 38 confirmed kills and twice as many captures to his name. Their arrogance would be their undoing. A bitter autumn wind howled through Copper Gulch, rattling the wooden signs that hung from the buildings lining its muddy main street. The mining town, nestled deep in the Colorado Rockies, had seen better. Days since the copper vein ran thin 2 years ago, the Thirsty Mule Saloon stood as one of the few remaining businesses still turning a profit, thanks largely to its unassuming new owner who'd taken over 6 months prior. James Mason worked his bar with quiet efficiency, his graying temples and slight limp painting the picture of a man content with his modest lot in life. His calloused hands moved with practiced precision as he poured whiskey and settled minor disputes with nothing more threatening than a stern look. Only the most observant might notice how his pale blue eyes constantly scanned the room, cataloguing every patron's position with unconscious habit, or how the mirrored wall behind his bar offered views of both entrances. If you're enjoying this story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's tale will leave you breathless. CD. Crimson Riders had carved a bloody path through 3 territories, their reputation growing with each raid. Leading them was Viktor Red Hand Kovalev, a Russian immigrant whose cruel smile never quite reached his cold eyes. The story went that he'd earned his nickname after dipping his hands in his victim's blood, though few lived to verify such tales. His younger brother Dmitri rode at his side, a man whose boyish face belied the pleasure he took in causing pain. Behind them came their loyal enforcers, brothers Marcus and Michael Thorne, whose matching pearl-handled revolvers had ended more than a dozen lives in the past year alone. The hulking figure of Bear Baldwin seemed to make the floorboards groan beneath his massive frame, while quick Charlie Chen's nimble fingers were as skilled with a knife as they were at cheating at cards. Bringing up the rear was William, Bible Bill McGraw, whose habit of quoting scripture while committing atrocities had earned him a special kind of notoriety. The gang had chosen Copper Gulch carefully. Its remote location and dwindling population made it an ideal target for their particular brand of methodical cruelty. They'd already worked their way through 2 smaller mining camps further up in the mountains, leaving nothing but ashes and grieving widows in their wake. Word was that local law enforcement had all but abandoned the area, leaving the scattered communities to fend for themselves. Ava Chen watched from her position at the end of the bar, her hand instinctively touching the jade pendant at her neck. She knew Mason's true identity, or at least pieces of it that he'd shared during quiet moments after closing time. She'd seen the collection of wanted posters hidden in his private room above the saloon, each one marked with neat notes in his precise handwriting. The mysterious brand on his Remington revolver, though he'd made her swear never to speak of it, told its own story of a secret organization of elite bounty hunters that most believed was merely frontier legend. The Crimson Riders swaggered into the saloon like they owned it, their spurs ringing against the wooden floor. They didn't notice how Mason's hands stilled mid-polish, didn't see the way his posture shifted ever so slightly, didn't realize that for the first time in months, the legendary bounty hunter felt the familiar tension coiling in his muscles, like a rattlesnake preparing to strike. Young Tommy Hayes watched wide-eyed from his position bussing tables, his heart hammering in his chest. He'd heard whispered stories about the new barkeep, fragments of tales that painted a picture of a man whose tracking skills and marksmanship were nothing short of supernatural. His uncle Frank, had warned him never to mention the time he'd spotted. Mason practicing at dawn, drawing and firing with a speed that seemed to defy human limitation, his bullets cutting playing cards in half at 20 paces. As the saloon's regular patrons began to quietly make their way toward the exits, Mason carefully set down the glass he'd been polishing. His movements, despite their deliberate slowness, carried an underlying grace that seemed at odds with his humble appearance. He nodded slightly to Ava Chen, a subtle signal developed over months of careful preparation. Ava understood. It was time to put their contingency plans into motion. Trouble had finally found the Thirsty Mule, but it had no idea what kind of man it was about to face. The Crimson Riders wasted no time making their presence known in the Thirsty Mule. Dmitry Kovalev commandeered the largest table, kicking over chairs and sending a pair of elderly miners scrambling toward the door. The Thorne brothers positioned themselves near the windows, while Bear Baldwin's massive frame cast a shadow over the bar itself. Viktor Kovalev stood at its center, surveying his surroundings like a wolf sizing up its hunting ground. Ava Chen, who had worked at the establishment since before Mason's arrival, studied the newcomers with growing concern. In 12 years of serving drinks in frontier towns, she'd learned to read violence in men's faces like others read books. These men reeked of bloodshed. She'd already caught Tommy Hayes's eye and nodded toward the back door where he would alert. "Dr. Morrison, according to their long-established protocols." "Whiskey," Victor commanded, dropping a blood-stained gold coin that Ava knew had to be stolen. "Leave the bottle." His voice carried the harsh accent of his homeland, mixed with the coarse edge of someone who'd spent too many nights shouting orders over gunfire. When Mason placed the bottle before him, Victor grabbed his wrist. "Tell me something, friend," he said, steel-gray eyes studying the barkeep's face. "How long have you owned this lovely establishment?" Mason kept his composure despite the iron grip on his wrist, remembering similar interrogations from his bounty hunting. "Days. 6 months now," he replied evenly. "Bought it from the widow Cooper when the mines started failing." Victor's laugh revealed metal teeth that caught the afternoon light. 6 months? Hear that, brothers? We've got ourselves a fresh businessman." His gang roared with laughter, but Ava noticed how Victor's eyes narrowed, studying Mason's face for any sign of deception or fear. Outside, Dr. Samuel Morrison emerged from his clinic down the street, his medical bag in hand. Few in Copper Gulch knew he'd served as a battlefield surgeon during the bloody mining wars in Nevada. Even fewer knew he'd been the one to dig 2 bullets out of Mason's back 4 months ago, when the bounty hunter had appeared at his door in the dead of night, refusing to explain how he'd been shot. "Fine day for a drink," Morrison said quietly as he passed the saloon's window, his words carrying a hidden weight. It was their code, established during late-night conversations over bourbon, when Mason had revealed just enough of his past for the doctor to understand what might be coming. "Storm's brewing, Doc," Mason replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Might want to prepare your surgery." His fingers, no longer holding a glass, twitched almost imperceptibly near his hip, where an old gun belt would have hung. Inside the saloon, Dmitry Kovalev was getting rougher, breaking bottles and threatening patrons while his brother watched with cold amusement. Bear Baldwin had discovered the storage room where Mason kept his strongbox, his massive hands already working to break the lock. Across the street, Martha Reynolds was closing her boarding house when she caught Mason's eye through the saloon's window. She'd come to Copper Gulch after fleeing an abusive marriage in San Francisco and had recognized something in Mason's careful movements the day he arrived. The same controlled power she'd seen in her father, a former prizefighter who'd taught her that true strength often hid behind quiet facades. Now she gave Mason a slight nod and gestured to her building's upper floor. He acknowledged with an almost imperceptible tilt of his head. Her boarding house offered the perfect vantage point. of both the saloon's entrances and the street, ideal for what might come. Young Tommy Hayes slipped out the back door of the saloon, moving quietly as Mason had taught him during their secret shooting lessons his mother pretended not to know about. He carried a message to Reverend Wright, who would ensure the town's women and children found safe shelter in the church's basement. Tommy had discovered more about their barkeep than most. He'd seen the mysterious brand on Mason's revolver when he was cleaning the private room upstairs, had recognized the symbol from stories his grandfather used to tell about the legendary Ghost Riders, an elite force of bounty hunters who'd worked in secret for the government during the border wars. The afternoon sun cast long shadows down Copper Gulch's main street as Mason calculated his next move. In his previous life, before he'd traded his tracking skills for a bartender's apron, he'd faced worse odds. But then, he'd been a different man, one who could act without worrying about innocent lives caught in the crossfire. Now, he had a business to protect people who trusted him, a chance at the kind of peaceful life he wasn't sure he deserved. His hand moved to adjust the clean bar rag over his shoulder, a deliberate gesture to maintain his carefully constructed facade. Soon, he would have to shed this humble disguise, would have to become again the man whose name had once made hardened killers tremble. But for now he watched and waited, knowing that timing, like a well-aimed shot, meant everything. Through the saloon's windows he could see more of the Crimson Riders arriving in town, their crimson bandanas like splashes of blood against the grey autumn sky. Two more took up positions on the boarding house's porch, while another pair disappeared down the alley beside the general store. But what they couldn't see was how the town of Copper Gulch had been preparing for a day like this, how each resident played a part in a plan months in the making. Inside the Thirsty Mule, the Crimson Riders' true intentions began to surface like wolves shedding sheep's clothing. Viktor Kovalev leaned against the bar, his scarred face reflected in its polished surface as he laid out his plans to his men, their voices growing louder with each drink, carried through the thin walls. They'd hold Copper Gulch hostage, squeezing every business for protection money, then burn it all down when they'd taken everything worth taking. They had no idea that James Mason was already setting his own plans in motion, his mind working with the same lethal precision that had once made him legendary. Through the saloon's windows, he could see quick Charlie Chen getting bolder, harassing old Frank Hayes, who hadn't evacuated quickly enough. The young outlaw's knife gleamed as he flipped it from hand to hand, a showman's trick that spoke more of vanity than true skill. 6 months of quiet, Dr. Morrison muttered, slipping behind the bar under the pretense of getting a drink. Suppose it was too good to last. The doctor set his medical bag beneath the counter, the instruments inside clinking softly. 11 of them now, heavily armed. Reminds me of the mining wars. Mason's pale blue eyes never left the room as he replied in a near whisper, "In my experience, Sam, it's not about the numbers, it's about knowing your ground." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd learned such lessons the hard way. "You still keep that surgery room ready?" "Since the day you showed me that brand on your revolver," Morrison answered, keeping his voice low. "Never thought I'd see the mark of the Ghost Riders again. They all died in that massacre at Black Wolf Canyon." A shadow passed across Mason's face. "Not all of us." His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where, beneath his shirt, lay a matching brand. "Sometimes surviving is the harder path." Ava Chen was carefully moving bottles of whiskey away from the bar's back wall. She remembered the night 3 months ago when Mason had helped her reinforce that wall with steel plating, claiming it was just a precaution. Now, she understood he'd been preparing for this day since he arrived. Martha Reynolds appeared at the saloon's back door, her movements swift and silent. "My father always said the high ground wins the fight," she whispered, barely audible above the gang's growing rowdiness. "Second floor is ready, just like you asked." She placed a small key on the bar, the key to her boarding house's back entrance. Mason nodded, the gesture containing volumes of unspoken understanding. In the 6 months since he'd bought the Thirsty Mule, he'd positioned his pieces, carefully building a network of trust with key members of the community. Each one held a piece of his true identity, but only Ava Chen knew the whole story, how the legendary Ghost Eye Mason had come to Copper Gulch, seeking redemption for the blood on his hands. Through the window they watched as Bible Bill McGraw emptied his revolver into the ceiling, laughing as he quoted Revelation while dust and splinters rained down. Each shot made Dr. Morrison flinch, but Mason remained still, only his eyes moving as he tracked the gang's positions. "You've got that look," Morrison observed quietly. "Same look I saw on men's faces before the big battles in the mining wars, the ones who knew what was coming but chose to stand their ground anyway." "In the wars," Mason replied, finally turning. "From the window, you fought because those were your orders. This is different." He moved to the end of the bar, opening a hidden panel where a matched pair of well-oiled Remington revolvers lay wrapped in oiled cloth. "These people took me in, gave me a chance when my reputation should have condemned me. Tommy brings me coffee every morning, even though his mother still crosses the street when she sees me coming. Reverend Wright invited me to Sunday services despite the whispers about my past. Martha planted those flowers outside my door until I had something to look at besides old wanted posters." His fingers traced the mysterious brand on the gun's grips, a howling wolf surrounded by stars. "I didn't come here looking for redemption, Sam, but sometimes redemption finds you anyway." Tommy Hayes slipped back into the saloon through the kitchen, his young face flushed with purpose. "Reverend Wright's got everyone safely hidden in the church basement," he reported in a whisper. "And I saw something else. They've got 3 more men watching the town from the ridge. They're carrying rifles." Mason's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. 14 against 1, he mused. "Better odds than I had at Black Wolf Canyon." He turned to Dr. Morrison. "Get your surgery ready, but not for me. When this starts, there'll be others who need your skills more." The afternoon light, filtering through the saloon's dusty windows, had taken on the copper hue of autumn, casting long shadows that stretched like accusing fingers across the wooden floor. In the main room, the Crimson Riders' laughter grew louder, more raucous, unaware that their every move was being watched by eyes that had once dealt death with surgical precision. "Time to make a choice," Mason said quietly, more to himself than his companions. He picked up another glass to polish, but his movements had changed, becoming more fluid, more purposeful. The simple barkeep's facade was starting to crack, revealing glimpses of the predator beneath. Ghost Eye Mason was stirring, and the Crimson Riders were about to learn why that name had once made the most hardened outlaws wake, screaming in the night. The sun's gradual descent cast amber light through the Thirsty Mule's grimy windows as Mason moved with deliberate purpose toward the storage room behind the bar, his boots, no longer carrying the hesitant step of a simple barkeep, struck the wooden floor with measured precision. 20 years of masking his true nature dissolved. As muscle memory took over, each movement calculated, each step purposeful. The storage room revealed little about its owner to casual observers, crates of whiskey, barrels of beer, and supplies for the saloon. But beneath the floorboards, under a loose plank that no one had ever noticed, lay the tools of his former trade, hidden away the day he'd bought the establishment. The board came up easily, revealing a worn leather case he hadn't opened since arriving in Copper Gulch. Inside, wrapped in oiled canvas, lay his true companions, the matched pair of Remington revolvers, their grips darkened by years of use. The mysterious brand marked both weapons, the howling wolf surrounded by stars, symbol of an organization most thought was merely frontier legend. His fingers traced the symbols, remembering the night they'd been seared into both steel and flesh. "I wondered when you'd open that case," Ava Chen's voice came softly from the doorway. She entered, closing the door behind her. 14 of them now, according to Tommy. 3 on the ridge with rifles. Mason nodded, continuing his inspection. Winchester 73s, most likely. The Crimson Riders always liked their long-range insurance. His voice had changed, dropping the friendly tone he'd affected for months, returning to something darker, more suited to his true nature. The town's asking questions, Ava continued, watching him work. They've never seen you wear a gun. Alone too. She paused, then added, They don't know about Black Wolf Canyon. Mason's hands stilled on his weapons. No one knows the whole truth about Black Wolf Canyon. The newspapers got it wrong, called it a massacre. 20 ghost riders gunned down by a gang of border raiders. His pale blue eyes met Ava's. They never found out it was an inside job. Our own commander, Marcus Cross, sold us out for a pardon and a fortune in stolen gold. Is that why you became a barkeep? Ava asked quietly. To make up for what he did. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. I became a barkeep because dying was too easy. Living with what I've done, that's the harder path. In the main room, the Crimson Riders had grown bolder. Bible Bill's random shots had given way to methodical destruction. Bear Baldwin's massive hands splintered chairs, while Quick Charlie Chen carved obscenities into tabletops with his prized knife. Viktor Kovalev sat watching it all, his cold eyes occasionally drifting to the storage room door. Something ain't right, Viktor muttered, more to himself than his men. A town this size, this isolated, should have more fight in it. Instead, they're scattering like rats, organized like. Dr. Morrison worked efficiently in his clinic, laying out instruments, with the same precision he'd used in field hospitals during the mining wars. Martha Reynolds appeared with clean linens, her movements silent as she helped prepare. They worked without speaking, the routine familiar from the night 4 months ago when Mason had first revealed his true identity. You knew this was coming, Morrison finally said, arranging his tools. That's why you had me stock extra supplies, Martha nodded toward the window. He's been preparing us all. The reinforced walls in the saloon, the escape routes through the alleys, the signal system with the church bells, like pieces on a chessboard, she explained, seeing Morrison's confusion. My father taught me that victory is determined before the first move is made. Outside, Copper Gulch had taken on an eerie quiet. The Crimson Riders' laughter and occasional gunshots seemed to echo off empty buildings while hidden eyes watched from carefully prepared positions. Tommy Hayes moved, through back alleys delivering messages between the town's defenders, just as Mason had trained him. 14 against 1, he whispered to himself, remembering the shooting lessons where Mason had taught him more than just aim. In his private room, Mason strapped on his gun belt, the familiar weight settling like an old sin against his hips. He'd spent 6 months building a life in Copper Gulch, creating something honest from the ashes of his past. Now he would risk it all, become again the man whose name once made hardened killers pray. Ava, he said quietly, checking his guns one final time. If this goes wrong, it won't, she interrupted. This town needs you, James. Not the myth, not Ghost Eye Mason, but the man who spent 6 months showing us what protection really means. He moved to the window, studying the lengthening shadows. The time for hiding was over. Get word to Martha. When this starts, her position will be crucial. He paused, his pale blue eyes carrying the weight of unspoken words. Whatever happens, whatever you hear about who I was, remember who I chose to become. The sun touched the mountains, painting Copper Gulch in shades of blood and gold. In the saloon, the Crimson Riders continued their revelry, unaware that death was about to revisit a bounty hunter who'd tried so hard to forget its touch. The evening, shadows stretched across Copper Gulch like dark fingers reaching for prey. Through the window of Martha's boarding house, Mason could see every detail of the saloon's main room. Victor Kovalov had old Frank Hayes cornered now, his scarred face twisted in a mockery of a smile as he toyed with a gold coin, flipping it between his fingers. Behind the bar, Dmitry Kovalev was methodically shooting bottles, each shattering pop, making the few remaining patrons flinch. "Your father taught you well," Mason murmured to Martha, who stood beside him watching the scene below. "This position controls the entire street." His pale blue eyes tracked the three riflemen on the ridge, barely visible in the growing dusk. Through the window's reflection, he caught Martha's slight smile. "My father always said the best warrior is the one enemies don't see coming," she replied, adjusting a stack of freshly pressed linens that cleverly concealed a Winchester rifle. "Like you, pretending to be nothing but a simple barkeep." Mason's hand rested on his Remington, fingers tracing the branded grip. "Sometimes the best disguise is letting people see what they expect to see." He moved slightly, keeping track of Quick Charlie Chen as the gang's knife expert began a methodical patrol of the street. "They expect a frightened town, so they see. They expect a weak barkeep, so that's what I showed them." Down in the street, Chen was getting bolder, testing doors and peering into windows. His prized knife danced between his fingers as he approached Frank Hayes' store. The old man hadn't evacuated fast enough and now stood trembling behind his counter as Chen entered, the little bell above the door chiming with deceptive cheerfulness. "Time to move," Mason said quietly. He checked his revolvers one final time, then nodded to Martha. "Remember the signal." He descended through the back of the boarding house, his movements fluid and silent. 20 years of bounty hunting had taught him that patience often killed more surely than speed. He'd spent 6 months learning every shadow in Copper Gulch, every creaking board, every angle of sight. Now that knowledge would become a weapon as deadly as his revolvers. In the saloon, Victor Kovalev was growing suspicious of the town's organized evacuation. "Dmitry," he called to his brother, "take a ride around the outskirts. Something ain't sitting right." He turned to Bear Baldwin. "You and Bible Bill check the church. Town this size should be hearing prayers by now." Mason watched through the gaps between buildings as the gang began to split up, exactly as he'd planned. Divide and isolate, the same strategy that had made the Ghost Riders legendary before Black Wolf Canyon. He moved like a shadow through the alley behind the general store, timing his steps with Dimitri's horse hooves to mask any sound. Inside the store, Quick Charlie Chen was threatening Frank Hayes, demanding to know where the townspeople had gone. The old man's voice shook as he claimed ignorance, but his eyes kept darting to the back room where his grandson Tommy hid with his fingers wrapped around the derringer Mason had given him. "Your first shot has to count," Mason had told him during their secret lessons, because sometimes you only get one. He'd taught him where to aim, how to steady his hands, when to breathe. Now he prayed the boy wouldn't need those lessons. Dr. Morrison watched from his clinic window as Dmitry Kovalev rode past, the Russian's silver-plated revolver gleaming in the last rays of sunlight. The doctor's hands moved automatically, arranging his instruments as he'd done in field hospitals during the mining wars. "Like Thunder Canyon," he whispered to himself, "the calm before the storm." Ava Chen had positioned herself in the saloon's back room, pretending to take inventory while actually monitoring Victor Kovalov through a small hole in the wall, another of Mason's careful preparations. She watched the gang leader pace, his confidence beginning to crack as the town's silence worked on his nerves. "Something ain't right," Kovalev muttered again, his scarred face reflected in the mirror behind the bar. "A town this size should have more fight, more panic. Instead, it's like they were expecting us." Through the window, Ava saw Mason's signal. A slight movement of his hand as he passed between buildings. She reached beneath the bar, fingers finding the hidden lever that would drop the steel shutters Mason had installed months ago. Just a precaution, he'd said then. Now she understood he'd been preparing for war since the day he arrived. Martha. Reynolds's voice suddenly rang out in melodious Chinese, the foreign sounds echoing off the buildings. Right on cue, Tommy Hayes began ringing the church bell in an irregular pattern, the sounds seeming to come from multiple directions as they bounced off the surrounding hills. The effect was immediate. Dmitry Kovalev wheeled his horse around, momentarily confused by the disorienting noise. Mason allowed himself a grim smile. Confusion, distraction, isolation, the same tactics the Ghost Riders had used in their prime. But this time, these skills would protect rather than destroy. He moved into position behind the general store, knowing that Quick Charlie Chen would soon step out to investigate the commotion. The best shot, he had told Tommy during their lessons, is the one your enemy never sees coming. As the sun dipped below the mountains, Ghost Eye Mason prepared to demonstrate just how true those words were. The time for hiding was over. Copper Gulch was about to learn why their quiet barkeep's name had once made hardened killers wake screaming in the night. The confusion sown by Martha's Chinese commands and Tommy's strategic bell ringing had its intended effect. Quick Charlie Chen stepped out of the general store, his prized knife held ready as he tried to locate the source of the foreign shouts. The setting sun cast long shadows across Main Street, making every darkened doorway a potential threat. "Boss!" Chen called out, his voice carrying an edge of uncertainty. "Something ain't—" The word died in his throat as Mason's first move revealed itself. The steel shutters Ava had prepared crashed down over the saloon's windows with a thunderous bang, trapping Viktor Kovalev inside. Simultaneously, Martha's voice shifted to a different position, now seeming to come from behind the livery stable, making it impossible for the gang to pinpoint her location. Chen spun toward the noise, his knife tracking the sound. It was the last mistake he would ever make. Mason moved like liquid shadow, emerging from his hiding place with the fluid grace of a born killer. His first shot came from hip level, the Remington seeming to materialize in his hand rather than be drawn. "Always control the first move," he'd told Tommy during their lessons. "It sets the tone for everything that follows." The bullet caught Chen's knife hand, sending his prized blade spinning away before he could throw it. The outlaw's scream of pain was lost in the echo of the gunshot bouncing off the buildings. Inside the saloon, Viktor Kovalev's reaction revealed his experience. Instead of wasting bullets on the steel shutters, he immediately dove behind the reinforced bar, dragging Frank Hayes with him as a shield. "Dmitri!" he shouted, but the street noise made it impossible to know if his brother could hear him. Dmitry Kovalev, caught in the open on his horse, demonstrated far less tactical sense. He fired wildly at shadows, his silver-plated revolver spitting flame. As Martha's voice seemed to come from yet another direction, his horse, panicked by the gunfire, reared and nearly threw him. Mason was already moving, using the confusion to slip through the back alleys he'd spent months memorizing. In the dying light, his dark clothes made him nearly invisible as he worked his way toward his next position. Through the gaps between buildings, he could see Bear Baldwin and Bible Bill racing back from the church, having found it empty. Dr. Morrison watched from his clinic window as Chen clutched his ruined hand, blood seeping between his fingers. "First blood," he muttered, arranging his surgical instruments with practiced efficiency. "Now we'll see if they break or rally." Inside the general store, Frank Hayes held his grandson Tommy close, both of them listening to the chaos erupting outside. "Remember what Mason taught you," he whispered, feeling the derringer pressed against his side where Tommy still gripped it. "Sometimes the best fight is the one you avoid." Viktor Kovalev's voice boomed from inside the saloon, carrying notes of both rage and calculation. "Whoever's out there, you just signed your death warrant. I've got your precious old man here, and I'll start taking pieces off him if you don't show yourself." Ava Chen, still hidden in the back room, caught Mason's eye through a carefully prepared gap in the wall. She gestured subtly, indicating that Kovalev was keeping Frank Hayes between himself and the front door, exactly as they'd anticipated. Mason nodded once. Everything was proceeding according to plan. Bear Baldwin proved his inexperience by running straight down the middle of the street toward the saloon. Bible Bill, showing more sense, tried to stick to the shadows of the boardwalk. Neither of them noticed how the street's layout had been subtly altered over the past months. Certain barrels moved, certain sight lines blocked, creating a deadly maze that Mason knew by heart. Another shot rang out, this one from Martha's position above. The Winchester barked once, the bullet striking the ground at Dimitri's horse's feet. The animal reared again, this time successfully throwing its rider. Dimitri landed hard, his silver-plated revolver skittering across the dirt. "Like my father taught me," Martha whispered, working the rifle's lever action. "Sometimes the threat of the bullet works better than the bullet itself." Mason moved through the gathering darkness like a ghost, his pale blue eyes catching what little light remained. Every step had been planned, every angle considered. In the Ghost Riders they'd called him Ghost Eye, not just for his accuracy, but for his ability to see paths of attack that others missed. He reached his next position just as Bear Baldwin approached the saloon's front door. The huge man was about to learn the hardest lesson of his short career. Sometimes the most obvious path was also the deadliest. Mason's second Remington cleared leather as smoothly as the first had, its branded grip catching the last ray of sunlight. "The difference between a killer and a hunter," he'd once told Tommy, "is that a killer takes life because he can. A hunter takes life because he must." As the sun finally set behind the mountains, Ghost Eye Mason prepared to demonstrate the difference. Copper Gulch was about to witness firsthand why his name had once been whispered around campfires like a prayer to ward off death itself. The last light of day faded from Copper Gulch as Bear Baldwin reached for the saloon door, his massive frame reflected in the darkened windows behind him. Bible Bill moved with surprising stealth for a man of the cloth, using the shadows of the boardwalk for cover. Neither man saw Mason's shadow detach itself from the darkness between buildings. "First rule of survival," Mason's voice carried across the empty street, stopping Baldwin in his tracks. "Never be predictable." The words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, bouncing off the buildings in the growing darkness. Baldwin spun, his shotgun clearing leather with the raw power of youth. His shot went wide, splintering wood where Mason had been a heartbeat before. "Second rule." Mason's voice came from a different direction now, making both men turn again. "Know when you're outmatched." His Remingtons barked twice in rapid succession. The first bullet took Baldwin's shotgun, sending it spinning away into the darkness. The second caught Bible Bill in the shoulder as the man tried to bring his revolver to bear, the impact spinning him off the boardwalk. Inside the saloon, Viktor Kovalev heard his men's cries of pain. "Whoever's out there," he shouted, pressing, his gun harder against Frank Hayes's temple. "You're signing these people's death warrants. Show yourself." "Third rule," Mason's voice replied, closer now. "Never threaten what a man is willing to die protecting." Before Kovalev could react, the back window of the saloon exploded inward. Martha's Winchester spoke again, the bullet striking the mirror. Behind the bar, with surgical precision, in the chaos of falling glass, Ava Chen activated the second set of mechanisms. Steel shutters slammed down over the back windows and doors, sealing the saloon completely, like catching tigers, Martha whispered, working the rifle's lever action. "Corner them, then wait." Dmitri Kovalev had regained his feet, blood running from a cut on his forehead where he'd struck the ground. His prized silver-plated revolver lay in the dirt several yards away, gleaming faintly in the starlight. He started toward it, then froze, as Mason's voice came again. "Fourth rule, pride kills faster than bullets." The words hung in the air like smoke. "That gun's not worth dying for, boy." Dimitri's face contorted with rage. "Show yourself, coward! Face me like a man!" He dove for his weapon, rolling and coming up firing. His shots lit up the darkness, revealing nothing but empty shadows. "Fifth rule," Mason's voice was behind him now. "Never waste ammunition on shadows." The last word ended with the explosive report of a Remington. Dmitry Kovalev screamed as a bullet shattered his knee, his silver-plated revolver falling from nerveless fingers as he collapsed. Dr. Morrison watched from his clinic window as Bear Baldwin dragged himself toward an alley, leaving a dark trail. In the dirt, Bible Bill cradled his ruined shoulder, all pretense of religious fervor gone from his face. "He's hurting them," the doctor realized, remembering similar tactics from the mining wars. Like a wolf separating the weak from the strong. Inside the general store, Tommy Hayes felt his grandfather tense as Dmitry Kovalev's scream echoed through the town. "Mason's not killing them," he whispered, understanding dawning in his young mind. "He's making examples of them." Frank Hayes nodded, pride mixing with fear in his voice. "He's showing those riflemen on the ridge what happens when you threaten his town." They both knew the three watchmen were still up there, observing their companions fall one by one. In the saloon, Victor Kovalev's composure was cracking. Frank Hayes remained held firmly against him as a shield, but his eyes darted between the steel-covered windows and doors. "You think these tricks make you a big man?" he shouted. "I've got hostages, you hear me? Their blood's on your hands." Final rule? Mason's voice seemed to come from inside the saloon itself, though no one could see him. "Never play your last. Guard, too early." In his words, Ava Chen triggered the last of his preparations. The reinforced sections of the bar top suddenly swung up on hidden hinges. Frank Hayes, who had been positioned precisely for this moment, dove behind them as Kovalev's gun roared uselessly. Outside, Dmitry Kovalev crawled toward his fallen brother's silver revolver, leaving a trail of blood in the dirt. "Still trying. To prove something, boy?" Mason's voice held a note of what might have been pity. "Some lessons have to be learned the hard way." The night had fully claimed Copper Gulch now, the only illumination coming from the stars and the occasional muzzle flash as the Crimson Riders fired at phantoms. Mason moved through the darkness like a creature born to it, his pale blue eyes reflecting what little light remained. Every shot he fired found its mark with mechanical precision, wounding rather than killing, each bullet delivering a message to the riflemen on the ridge. "In the Ghost Riders," he had told Ava during one of their late-night conversations, "we learned that fear was a more effective weapon than death. Dead men tell no tales, but wounded men spread warnings." As if to emphasize his point, Bible Bill's voice cracked with pain and terror. "He's not human! He can't be human!" The fallen preacher's cries echoed off the buildings, carrying clearly to where his companions watched helplessly from the ridge. In the deepening night, Copper Gulch was about to learn why Ghost Eye Mason had become a legend, and why some legends were born not from how many men they killed, but from how they chose to show mercy. The night air carried the metallic scent of blood and gun smoke as Copper Gulch's streets fell momentarily silent. Dmitry Kovalev lay cursing in the dirt, his shattered knee preventing any escape. Bible Bill had backed himself into a corner of the boardwalk, his ruined shoulder clutched to his chest, while Bear Baldwin's massive form was slumped in an alley, his prized shotgun abandoned beside him. Inside the saloon, Victor Kovalev's voice had lost its earlier bravado. "What are you?" he called out, the words carrying a tremor he couldn't quite hide. "Show yourself." His only answer was the creaking of wooden boards as unseen movement circled the building. From her position behind the reinforced bar, Ava Chen watched through. A carefully prepared gun port as Kovalev's composure continued to crack. The notorious gang leader's eyes darted between the steel-covered windows and the shadows that seemed to shift in impossible ways. "Your men are down," Mason's voice materialized. "From nowhere and everywhere. Your riflemen on the ridge haven't fired a shot. Ask yourself why." The words hung in the air like smoke, each syllable calculated to increase Kovalev's growing fear. Martha Reynolds' voice rang out again in Chinese, this time from a completely different direction than before. On cue, Tommy Hayes began ringing. The church bell in that irregular pattern that made it impossible to track its true source. The combination of foreign commands and disorienting sounds had a devastating effect on the remaining gang members' nerves. "Ghost Riders!" Dmitri gasped from his position in the street, recognition and terror mixing in his voice. "The brand on his guns, he's one of them." His words carried to the ridge, where his three companions watched helplessly as their plan unraveled. Dr. Morrison moved silently through the shadows, reaching Bear Baldwin's position. The huge man didn't resist as the doctor began treating his wounds. "Your boss should have checked the wanted posters more carefully," Morrison said quietly as he worked. "Might have recognized the barkeep's eyes. Ghost Eye Mason. He died at Black Wolf Canyon with the rest of them," Baldwin muttered through clenched teeth. "Sometimes living is the harder path," Morrison replied, echoing Mason's words as he bandaged the wound. "Sometimes a man has to die to become something better." Inside the saloon, Ava Chen caught Viktor Kovalev off guard by speaking from her hidden position. "You know what your mistake was?" Her voice was steady, confident. "You saw a quiet town and thought it meant weakness. Never occurred to you that some wolves choose to guard the flock." Kovalev fired in the direction of her voice, the bullet embedding harmlessly in the reinforced wall. The shot cost him. In that moment of distraction, Frank Hayes slipped completely behind the fortified section of the bar, leaving him without a hostage. "No!" Kovalev's composure shattered entirely. He fired randomly now, each shot revealing more of his growing panic. Face me like a man!" A man? Mason's voice held a dangerous edge. "Men don't threaten innocent people. Men don't burn and towns for pleasure. You wanted the legend of Ghost Eye Mason. Congratulations, you found him." The words were still echoing when the oil lamps in the saloon suddenly went dark, plunging the interior into absolute blackness. Ava had reached the hidden valve that controlled the fuel lines, another of Mason's careful preparations. In the street, Bible Bill's nerve finally broke. "I surrender!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Please, I don't want to die like this." "Smart boy," Mason's voice came from the darkness. "Dr. Morrison will tend your shoulder. You'll live to remember this night, to tell others what happens when they mistake mercy for weakness." On the ridge, the three riflemen watched as their companions were systematically dismantled by an enemy they couldn't see. One of them raised his Winchester, trying to catch any movement in the streets below. "I wouldn't." Martha's voice came from directly behind them. Both men spun to find her Henry rifle unwavering, aimed at the space between them. "Mason thought you might try something foolish. That's why he sent me up here an hour ago." Inside the pitch-black saloon, Viktor Kovalev heard something that turned his blood to ice, the sound of boots on wooden floorboards, moving with deliberate slowness toward his position. He fired toward the noise, but the muzzle flash only served to blind him further. "Your gang threatened my town." Mason's voice was closer now, carrying the cold finality of a judge's gavel. You held a gun to people under my protection. Where I come from, that calls for a reckoning." The darkness erupted in a brilliant flash as Mason's Remington roared. Kovalev screamed as a bullet found his gun hand with surgical precision, his weapon clattering to the floor as he clutched his ruined fingers to his chest. "The legend you were so eager to meet." Mason's voice held no mercy now. "He died at Black Wolf Canyon. The man who replaced him is something far more dangerous. A killer who chose to become a protector. The night had transformed Copper Gulch into a battlefield where justice was delivered not through death, but through the carefully measured application of fear and pain. Ghost Eye Mason's legend was about to grow, not for the lives he took, but for the ones he chose to spare. The night settled over Copper Gulch like a burial shroud, broken only by occasional moans from the wounded Crimson Riders scattered through the streets. Viktor Kovalev stood in the darkened saloon, his shattered hand cradled against his chest, listening to the deliberate footsteps that circled his position like a wolf stalking wounded prey. "You want to know something interesting? About Black Wolf Canyon?" Mason's voice emerged from the darkness, each word measured and precise. 20 Ghost Riders went in that day. Official reports say none walked out, but they never found all the bodies, did they? Movement in the shadows made Kovalev fire wildly with his remaining good hand, the muzzle flash momentarily illuminating. Empty air. His shot was answered by the methodical sound of a Remington being cocked. The papers called it a massacre. Mason continued, his voice shifting position again. They were right about that part, but they got the story wrong. It wasn't the border raiders who did the killing. A bitter laugh echoed through the darkness. Marcus Cross sold us out for gold and amnesty, gave the raiders our location, then opened fire on his own men while they slept. On the ridge, Martha's Winchester kept the 3 remaining gang members covered as they lay face down in the dirt. "Mason says you have a choice," she informed them coolly. "Ride out now, spread the word about what happened here, or join your friends down there. Choose wisely." Dr. Morrison worked his way through the wounded, his experienced hands treating each injury with professional detachment. Bible Bill whimpered as the doctor examined his ruined shoulder. Will I ever shoot again?" the fallen preacher asked. "That's the point, son," Morrison replied, not unkindly. "Mason could have killed you. Instead, he gave you a chance to choose a different path." He glanced at Bear Baldwin, who sat silently watching the scene unfold. Some lessons have to be learned the hard way. Dmitry Kovalev had dragged himself to the boardwalk, leaving a trail of blood from his shattered knee. His prized, silver-plated revolver lay forgotten in the street, no longer the symbol of power he'd once imagined it to be. "Victor!" he called out to his brother. "Victor, for God's sake, surrender!" Inside the saloon, Ava Chen and Frank Hayes remained, safely behind the reinforced bar, watching through the gun ports as Mason's shadow moved with fluid grace through the darkness. Years of working in frontier saloons had taught Ava to read men's breaking points. Viktor Kovalev was reaching his. "I survived Black Wolf Canyon." Mason's voice carried an edge that made Kovalev's spine crawl. "Watched my friends die, betrayed by a man they trusted. Spent 3 days in that canyon, using skills meant for killing to keep myself alive. When I finally walked out, I made a promise." Kovalev fired again, his last bullet spending itself uselessly in the darkness. The empty click of his hammer was answered by Mason's voice, now directly behind him. "I promised I'd never kill for profit. Again. Never use my skills to terrorize the innocent. The man who walked out of that canyon wasn't the same one who walked in." The cold press of a Remington against Kovalev's neck made him freeze. Through the window of his clinic, Dr. Morrison watched as the 3 riflemen from the ridge rode hard out of town, their horses' hooves fading into the night. Martha appeared silently beside him, her Winchester still warm. "They'll spread the word," she said quietly, "just like he planned." Morrison nodded, remembering similar nights during the mining wars when psychological warfare had proved more effective than bullets. "Fear travels faster than lead," he murmured, "and leaves deeper scars." Tommy Hayes peered out from the general store's window, watching as his town's defenders emerged from their hidden positions. The night had transformed Copper Gulch, revealing strengths its people hadn't known they possessed. He thought about the shooting lessons Mason had given him, understanding now that he'd been teaching more than just aim. "A bullet can stop a man," he'd told Tommy, but wisdom can stop a fight before it begins. In the saloon, Viktor Kovalev finally broke. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice cracking with fear and pain. "Want?" Mason's voice held a trace of what might have been pity. "I want you to live, Viktor. Live and remember this night. Remember how it feels to be helpless at the mercy of someone more powerful. Remember what it's like to face a predator who chooses not to kill." The sound of a gun being holstered seemed unnaturally loud in the darkness. "You'll carry that memory like I carry Black Wolf Canyon. Every time your hand aches, every time you think about returning to your old ways, you'll remember the night you met the man Ghost Eye Mason became." Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the drama playing out beneath them. Copper Gulch had been transformed by violence into something stronger, its people united by the knowledge that their quiet barkeep was more than he appeared. But none of them, not even Ava Chen, could have guessed the full weight of the choice Mason was making. Sparing lives he could have easily taken, turning enemies into unwitting messengers of his legend. Dawn broke over Copper Gulch, painting the mountain peaks in shades of rose and gold. James Ghost Eye Mason stood on the porch of the Thirsty Mule, watching as Dr. Morrison's wagon carried the wounded Crimson Riders toward the territorial prison in Silver Creek. Viktor Kovalev sat among them, his bandaged hand a permanent reminder of the night's events. His brother Dmitri lay on a pallet in the wagon bed, his shattered knee ensuring he'd never again threaten an innocent town. By sunset, every outlaw camp from here to the territory line will know what happened, Ava Chen said softly, coming to stand beside him. How the Crimson Riders rode into Copper Gulch and met something they weren't prepared for. The town was coming back to life, its people emerging from their hiding places to find their home, changed but unbroken. Martha Reynolds swept her boardwalk. With precise strokes, her Winchester rifle once again hidden beneath innocent stacks of linens. Frank Hayes opened his store, the bell chiming cheerfully as if the previous night had been nothing but a bad dream. Bear Baldwin had surprised them all by surrendering himself formally to the sheriff's custody. "Ain't no percentage in running from a man like you," he'd said as Morrison bandaged his wounds. "Reckon I'd rather face a judge than wonder if Ghost Eye's behind every shadow." Tommy Hayes appeared from the general store, carrying a fresh pot of coffee for the men who'd worked through the night securing the prisoners. His movements showed a new confidence, born from the knowledge that he'd played his part in defending his town. "You taught us more than just defense," he said, pouring Mason a fresh cup. "You showed us how to be strong without becoming cruel." Mason studied the boy's face, seeing shadows of his own past choices reflected there. "The hardest lesson I learned at Black Wolf Canyon wasn't about shooting," he replied. "It was about the weight of mercy. Sometimes sparing a life teaches more than taking one." Reverend Wright emerged from his church, where he'd spent the night comforting those who'd sought shelter in the basement. The morning bell rang out clear and strong, no longer a signal of danger, but a call to prayer. The sound carried across Copper Gulch, marking the transition from darkness back to light. "Your secret's out now," Ava observed, watching townspeople pass by, their eyes carrying a new respect when they looked at their barkeep. "They know who you really are." Mason shook his head slightly. "They know who I was, who I am." He paused, considering his words carefully. "Is the man who chose to protect rather than destroy. Ghost Eye Mason died in Black Wolf Canyon. The man who walked out became something else." Frank Hayes approached, carrying fresh bread from the bakery. The experience of being held hostage had left its mark, but there was steel in his spine as he faced Mason. "Thank you," he said simply, "not just for saving me, but for showing us that even the darkest past can lead to a righteous future." "Doctor." Morrison returned from seeing off the wagon, his medical bag lighter after treating the night's casualties. Not a single death, he remarked, the observation carrying weight beyond the obvious. In all my years in the mining wars, I never saw such precise violence. Every shot calculated, every wound meant to teach rather than kill. The Ghost Riders taught me how to deal death, Mason replied, his voice carrying echoes of old pain. Black Wolf Canyon taught me why I shouldn't. Copper Gulch, he looked around at the town he'd chosen to protect. Copper Gulch taught me what to do with those skills instead. Martha joined them, her usual graceful movement showing no sign of her night spent on the ridge. My father would say you found balance, she offered, using darkness to defend the light. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night. Copper Gulch bustled with activity as people reclaimed their town, stronger for having faced down evil and emerged victorious. The legend of Ghost Eye Mason would grow from this night, but not in the way anyone might have expected. They'll be telling stories about this night, Ava said, watching the town come back to life. About the barkeep, who was really a legendary bounty hunter. About how he could have killed them all, but chose not to. Mason stood silently for a moment, his pale blue eyes reflecting the morning light. Let them tell the stories, he finally said, but make sure they tell the right one, not about a killer who found redemption, but about a town that gave him something worth protecting. The morning stage arrived right on schedule, carrying mail and travelers unaware of the drama that had unfolded during the night. Copper Gulch had changed, its people bonded by shared danger and triumph. They had seen their quiet barkeep transformed into something legendary, only to choose again the path of peace. Ghost Eye. Mason's legend would indeed grow, but as a protector rather than a killer, a guardian who proved that the most fearsome predator was the one who chose not to kill. A week after the Crimson Riders' defeat, Copper Gulch found itself facing an unexpected challenge. Word of Ghost Eye, Mason's reappearance had spread like wildfire across the territory, drawing a different kind of visitor. 3 young guns had arrived on the afternoon stage, their intentions clear from the way they sized up the town and its now famous barkeep. Mason watched them from behind his bar, his pale blue eyes tracking their movements as they swaggered toward the Thirsty Mule. They couldn't have been more than 25, reminding him painfully of faces he'd seen at Blacker. Wolf Canyon, young men too eager to make their mark, too blind to see the price of glory. More trouble, Ava Chen reported, bringing Mason his afternoon coffee. They're asking questions about that night, about how one man took down the Crimson Riders. She studied his face, seeing the weight of responsibility there. They're wearing guns despite my rules against it. Like moths to flame, Mason murmured, his fingers unconsciously tracing the Ghost Rider brand on his Remington's grip. It was the same after Black Wolf Canyon. Every hot-blooded kid with a gun wanted to test himself against the legend. Martha. Reynolds paused in sweeping her boardwalk, her movements still carrying the grace that had helped save the town. This isn't Black Wolf Canyon, she said quietly. You're not alone this time. Dr. Morrison emerged from his clinic, his medical bag in hand. He'd taken to carrying it more often lately, ever since word of the Crimson Riders' defeat had started drawing attention. Had a talk with them earlier, he reported. They think the stories are exaggerated, want to prove themselves against the famous Ghost Eye Mason. A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. Glory seekers never understand. Real hunters don't seek. Invites, they end them. His eyes tracked the youngest of the 3 as the man practiced quick draws when he thought no one was watching. And real legends are born from the fights we choose not to have. Tommy Hayes appeared from the general store, chess set tucked under his arm. Over the past week, their daily games had become a symbol of the town's return to normalcy. But today, Mason shook his head. Not now, Tommy. I need you to do something more important. He kept his voice low. Tell your grandfather to close the store. Have Martha bring her rifle to the back room like before." The boy's eyes widened, but he nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation as he hurried off. Mason stood, his movements deliberate despite the weight of what was to come. He could feel his Remingtons beneath his bar, but he walked past them where they hung on their pegs. "You're going out there unarmed?" Dr. Morrison asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Sometimes the bravest thing a hunter can do is choose not to hunt," Mason replied. "These boys don't need another lesson in killing. They need a lesson in living." The three gunslingers waited outside the Thirsty Mule, their hands hovering near their holsters. The youngest stepped forward as Mason approached, his face flushed with excitement or whiskey or both. "So you're the famous Ghost Eye," he called out. "The phantom who broke the Crimson Riders. Don't look so fearsome to me." Mason stood in the middle of the street, his presence somehow filling the space despite his relaxed posture. 20 years ago, I watched young men like you die in a canyon far from home," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "They died believing a fast gun made them immortal. It didn't." The oldest of the three laughed. "But there was uncertainty in it. Pretty words from a man who crippled 7 men last week." "I wounded them because I had to," Mason replied evenly. "You're here because you want to. That's the difference between necessity and foolishness." His hands hung loosely at his sides, far from any weapon. "I won't draw on you. I won't give you the glory you're seeking. If you want to shoot an unarmed man, go ahead. But remember, I didn't reach my age by being easy to kill." The moment stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight. Behind his office window, Martha kept her Winchester, trained on the scene. Ava Chen's hand rested near the lever that would drop the saloon's steel shutters. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the youngest gunman's hand moved toward his revolver. Before he could clear leather, Mason's voice cracked like a whip. "Black Wolf Canyon." The words froze them in place, confusion warring with recognition. 20 men died that night, Mason continued, his voice heavy with memory. Died believing their guns made them something special. Their bones are still there, bleaching in the sun, teaching a lesson no one seems to learn. The oldest gunslinger studied Mason's face, seeing something there that made him step back. "Come on, boys," he said quietly. "This ain't the kind of fight we're looking for." As they walked toward the stage depot, Mason remained in the street, his presence a reminder of battles fought and wisdom hard won. The town slowly came back to life around him, Frank Hayes sweeping his porch, Martha Reynolds returning to her laundry, Dr. Morrison putting away his medical bag. Tommy approached, with the chest set. "How did you know they wouldn't shoot?" Mason settled into his chair, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Because sometimes, boy, the hardest battle is choosing not to fight at all. That's a lesson worth more than any legend." A month after the Crimson Riders' defeat, autumn painted Copper Gulch's surrounding mountains in brilliant shades of gold and crimson. James Ghost Eye Mason stood behind his bar at the Thirsty Mule, the morning sun warming the polished wood as he prepared for another day. His Remingtons hung on their pegs beneath the bar, no longer a secret but no longer a burden either. The would-be challengers had stopped coming after word spread about the 3 gunslingers who'd left without firing a shot. Instead, different visitors began arriving, lawmen seeking advice, towns requesting help with troublemakers, and sometimes lost souls looking for the same redemption Mason had found. "Another letter came," Tommy Hayes said, bringing in the morning mail. "Says the advice you gave that sheriff in Silver Creek saved his town last week." He sorted through the stack with practiced efficiency, having taken on more responsibilities. Since that fateful night, Mason watched Copper Gulch come to life through his windows. The Thirsty Mule had transformed into an unofficial gathering place where experience and wisdom were shared over coffee instead of whiskey. Martha Reynolds' boarding house now housed a small shooting school where she taught the careful arts of defense to those Mason deemed worthy. Change is funny that way, Mason mused, his pale blue eyes reflecting the morning light. Sometimes it takes a brush with darkness to show us a better path. He touched the Ghost Rider's brand on his revolver, the symbol no longer a mark of shame, but a reminder of how far he'd come. Ava Chen appeared with fresh coffee, moving with the confidence of someone who'd faced their fears and emerged stronger. "They say the thirsty mules become famous," she remarked. "People come from all over hoping to hear the story of how Copper Gulch transformed its hunter into its guardian." Mason just smiled, finally at peace with both who he was and who he'd chosen to become. If this tale of redemption and justice spoke to you, make sure to subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. Tomorrow's story will take you on another unforgettable journey through the untold legends of the American frontier. Share in the comments where you're watching from, and let us know what you thought of Ghost Eye Mason's transformation from feared bounty hunter to beloved protector of Copper Gulch.